When was it you first met Ronald Reagan? Can you recall?
Absolutely. I will never forget the first moment I met him. I was a college student at Pepperdine, and I guess this wasn't my first time I met him, but the first time I saw him in person. He actually came to Pepperdine University. It was, I think, maybe his second speech after he had left office. And so it was early in 1989. He left office in January of 89, and he came to Pepperdine University and gave a speech. And typical college student, I overslept my alarm, but I went running down to the field house where he was speaking. I probably sat in the last row of the field house, but the electricity in the air and just being in the same room with somebody like that who was so important and so powerful, it was really a magical moment. I like to think maybe I invented the selfie because I actually have turned the camera around back in the old film days, so you never know it's going to work. I have a selfie with Ronald Reagan speaking at Pepperdine with me up in the rafters and him, a little tiny, like, where's Waldo type creature in the back. But it was this magical electric moment. And so fast forward just a few months later, I'm going into my final semester at Pepperdine. Like I said, I was a communications major, and my dad raised me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So I took a chance and wrote a letter, probably on an old typewriter, licked a stamp, stuck it in an envelope, mailed it off with a prayer, and never thought I would ever hear from the office of Ronald Reagan. But a couple of weeks later, I'm sitting in my dorm room, my telephone rings, I pick it up, and it's a woman from the office of Ronald Reagan. And she said she received my letter, that they were doing interviews for internships, and would I like to come in? And you don't say no to an opportunity like that. And I thought, even if I stepped foot on the floor where Ronald Reagan worked, it would be the most exciting day of my life. And so, of course, I agreed to the interview. I was extremely nervous. I had never met or been around anybody important or of stature like that. My family was very middle class. They were a class of educators. They were lovely, wonderful people, but weren't the donor class, weren't involved in these big wealthy circles. And so it certainly was not something I was comfortable with. But I was working my way through college at Nordstrom. So I did have an amazing wardrobe. So wearing what I was going to wear to the interview was not a stressor. Wardrobe check. Everything
Hmm.
else, I was going to have to wing it when I got there. So I get there to the office. I have a lovely conversation with a woman who was just warm and welcoming and so gracious and put me at ease. And I actually thought the interview had gone pretty well. So the interview's over. I go to the front office, and thankfully they agreed to validate my parking because as a starving college student, I was a little worried that I might not even have enough money to get out of the parking garage in Century City. And as I was waiting for the woman to come out with the parking validation stickers, the door on the opposite side of the lobby opens up. And walking toward me all of a sudden is United States Secret Service, Ronald Reagan himself. He
Wow.
was with Walter Annenberg. I found out later they were on their way to a golf game. And you have to understand, I didn't know what to do. And so I panicked and I thought, they don't know who I am. They don't know what I'm doing here. Are they going to arrest me? Are they going to shoot me? Should I run? Should I hide? What should I do? So that all these panic thoughts went through my head. And I instantaneously decided that what would I do if the flag was passing by? And so out of respect, I stood up and I put my hand over my heart and didn't even look at him, just kind of stared off into the distance so that it was non-threatening. I'm sure I looked completely ridiculous. But Ronald Reagan, instead of walking past me and laughing like he should have done, he walked right to me. He stuck out his hand. He said hello to me. I introduced myself to him. Of course, he needed no introduction. And even though I was horribly embarrassed, it's that moment that I will never forget. Looking into those bright blue eyes for the first time that were so sparkly and so full of life. And as much as I was terribly embarrassed by what had happened, I love that moment because that moment is seared in my mind forever. And over the course of the next 10 years, I would watch thousands of people have that moment with him. And he never missed an opportunity to look people in the eye, to make them feel special, heard, valued, even in that split second. So he was whisked away as quickly as he stopped. And the woman who had interviewed me saw the whole thing and looked over and kind of laughed at me. And I said, "You should have warned me." And she said, "No, no, it's better this way." Which I kind of agree now. But she said, "Well, we were going to wait until a few days from now to call you and at least leave you in suspense for a bit. But we know we already want you to work here. So can you start on Monday?" Yes, I can. And so that was how the story began. I was hired for what I thought would be just a short-term internship, maybe for the final semester as I was graduating from college. But at the end of that term, the woman actually who had interviewed me, she returned to Washington, D.C., and they asked me to take over her job. And so I went from being a volunteer in the office to having a full-time staff position in the office of Ronald Reagan. I served as the executive assistant to the chief of staff, also ran the internship program. So it was on the other side of that interview process hundreds of times over the
Mm,
next 10 years. And a couple of years after I had taken over the role as the EA to the chief of staff, Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had had since governor years, she retired and they asked me to take that job. And so you don't say no to a job opportunity like that, but I was 6 months pregnant at the time, wasn't quite sure how that was all going to work out. But the Reagans were wonderful. I wound up staying, serving Ronald Reagan from 1989 to 1999. So right after he left the White House until he left the public eye in 1999. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those later years later, but had 3 of my 4 kids while I was working for him. And it was
wow.
just chaotic and wonderful and a blessing to have a front row seat to history, all the people that came in and all the places we went. And it truly was remarkable. So I'm glad my dad reminded me that somebody's got to have the job you want. And it might as well be you. And how blessed I am that it was me.